Before we dive into Chris Redfield's full story, hit subscribe so you don't miss the rest of the Resident Evil lore deep dives. Chris Redfield is not just another action hero. He is the man who watched friends turn into monsters, buried entire cities, and kept going anyway. From the Spencer Mansion to the war against Wesker, this timeline follows every moment that broke him, rebuilt him, and turned him into the most relentless soldier the franchise has ever known. Part 1. Chris Redfield, Before Stars. Before he ever set foot in the cursed city of Raccoon, or stared down a biological nightmare, Chris Redfield was defined by the relentless blue of the open sky. His journey did not begin with a police badge, but with the roar of a jet engine. Chris was a highly decorated pilot in the United States Air Force, a role that demanded more than just technical skill. It required a specific kind of psychological makeup, one that combined absolute precision with the ability to make life or death decisions in a fraction of a second. In the cockpit, Chris was a natural. He possessed a legendary level of focus and a physical coordination that made him one of the finest pilots of his generation. It was here that he first earned his reputation for world-class marksmanship, a skill that would later save his life countless times. He was the kind of soldier who did not just hit the target, he mastered the weapon until it became an extension of his own will. However, the military life was not a perfect fit for a man like Chris. While he possessed an indomitable spirit and a fierce loyalty to his fellow soldiers, he was also notoriously rebellious. Chris was never a man who could easily stomach the cold, often heartless bureaucracy of a high-level military command. His career in the Air Force was marked by a series of high-profile clashes with his superior officers. These were not the tantrums of a difficult soldier, but the principled stands of a man who refused to allow ethical compromises to go unchallenged. Chris frequently found himself at odds with the chain of command over orders that he believed were morally bankrupt or unnecessarily dangerous to human life. He was a man who saw the people behind the numbers, a trait that made him a hero to those under his command, but a liability to those above him. The situation eventually reached a breaking point. Following a string of insubordination charges that highlighted his refusal to bend his moral compass, Chris Redfield was discharged from the Air Force. While many would have seen this as a failure, for Chris, it was a moment of clarity. He had learned that his primary allegiance was not to a flag or a rank, but to his own sense of justice. He returned to civilian life as a man without a mission, but he was not destined to stay in the shadows for long. His unique combination of elite combat training, investigative instincts, and aerial expertise made him a prime candidate for a very different kind of unit. He was eventually sought out by an old friend and mentor, Barry Burton. Barry recognized that the newly formed Special Tactics and Rescue Service, or STARS, needed men who were not just killers, but protectors. He saw in Chris the exact qualities required for the Alpha team, a man who was fearless, skilled, and possessed a level of integrity that could not be bought. When Chris accepted the offer to join the Raccoon City Police Department as part of the STARS unit, he believed he was finally finding a place where he could use his skills for the greater good. He saw it as a fresh start, a way to protect a community while staying true to the values that had cost him his military career. He had no way of knowing that he was simply moving from one corrupt system into the jaws of a global conspiracy that would eventually try to consume the entire world. This early era of his life established the foundation of the man he would become. He was the specialist, the rebel, and the protector, waiting for a war he did not yet know was coming. Part 2. Joining STARS and the Spencer Mansion. Setup. In the mid-1990s, Chris Redfield transitioned from the cockpit of a fighter jet to the streets of Raccoon City, taking on the role of point man for the Star's Alpha Team. This elite unit was designed to be the ultimate answer to specialized crime, and for a few years, Chris felt he had finally found his calling. The camaraderie within the unit was genuine. He formed a deep, unbreakable bond with Jill Valentine, a fellow operative who matched his skills and shared his dedication to justice. Together with Barry Burton and the rest of the team, they represented the pinnacle of law enforcement. Chris took his role seriously, spending hours at the shooting range and in tactical drills, perfecting the art of urban combat. He was the man the team sent through the door first, because they knew his reflexes were unparalleled. By the summer of 1998, however, the atmosphere in Raccoon City began to sour. Strange reports started filtering in from the outskirts of the city, specifically the dense woodlands of the Arklay Mountains. There were accounts of bizarre, cannibalistic killings that defied all rational explanation. Victims were found partially devoured, and witnesses spoke of shadowy figures moving through the woods that did not seem human. The local media dubbed these the Arklay Mountain Murders, and a palpable sense of dread began to settle over the community. As the bodies piled up, the STARS unit was finally given the order to deploy. Chris arrived at the office that day with an idealistic view of the mission. He believed they were heading into the mountains to track down a pack of crazed killers and bring them to justice. He felt the weight of the badge and the responsibility to protect the citizens who were living in fear. What Chris did not know was that the entire STARS organization was being manipulated by a shadow much larger than any local crime wave. His own captain, Albert Wesker, was not the stoic leader he appeared to be. Wesker was a double agent for the Umbrella Corporation, a pharmaceutical giant that used Raccoon City as a playground for its illegal biological experiments. The deployment of the STARS teams was never intended to be a successful rescue mission or a standard police operation. It was a cold, calculated combat data test. Umbrella needed to know how their newly developed bioorganic weapons would perform against the most elite human soldiers the world had to offer. Chris and his teammates were effectively being used as laboratory rats in a grand and lethal experiment. Wesker had spent months studying the strengths and weaknesses of every member of the Alpha and Bravo teams, waiting for the perfect moment to throw them into the jaws of Umbrella's creations. As the helicopters lifted off for the Arklay Mountains, Chris looked out over the city he swore to protect, unaware that the man sitting beside him was the architect of his destruction. He was entering the mountains as a policeman, but he would leave them as something entirely different. The setup was perfect. The trap was laid, and the night of July 24th would become the moment the world as Chris knew it ended, and the long, bloody war against the virus truly began. Part 3. Spencer Mansion Incident. The night of July 24th, 1998, remains the most significant turning point in the life of Chris Redfield. What was supposed to be a search and rescue mission for the missing Bravo team quickly descended into a visceral struggle for survival. Upon discovering the crashed helicopter of their comrades, Alpha Team was immediately ambushed by a pack of skinless, mutated hounds. In the ensuing chaos, the team was forced to flee toward a massive, isolated estate known as the Spencer Mansion. As the heavy doors slammed shut behind them, Chris found himself trapped in a labyrinth of Gothic architecture and hidden laboratories that served as the birthplace of a new kind of horror. The hours that followed were a descent into a biological hell. Chris moved through the mansion's suffocating hallways, discovering the remains of his friends and colleagues who had been torn apart or transformed into mindless, shambling corpses. This was his first encounter with the T virus, a pathogen that stripped away the humanity of its host and replaced it with a primal, never-ending hunger. For a man who valued human life above all else, seeing his teammates turned into monsters was a psychological trauma that would never truly heal. He witnessed the gruesome end of Joseph Frost and the tragic fate of Forrest Speyer, and with every body he found, his resolve hardened. This was not a crime. It was a massacre facilitated by science gone mad. As Chris delved deeper into the mansion's secrets, he uncovered the horrifying truth about the Umbrella Corporation. The mansion was a facade for an underground research facility where the laws of nature were being systematically dismantled. He found diaries and research logs that detailed the agonizing process of creating bioorganic weapons, revealing a level of corporate depravity that was almost impossible to comprehend. The climax of the night occurred in the depths of the underground laboratory, where the ultimate betrayal was finally revealed. Albert Wesker, the man Chris had trusted as his leader, stepped out of the shadows and admitted his allegiance to Umbrella. Wesker revealed that he had led them there to die, all for the sake of collecting combat data. The final confrontation was a battle between the pinnacle of human skill and the zenith of biological engineering. Wesker unleashed the Tyrant T-002, a massive, clawed super soldier designed to be the ultimate weapon of war. Chris was forced to stand his ground against a creature that possessed strength and speed far beyond any human limit. Through sheer will and the tactical support of Jill Valentine and Barry Burton, Chris managed to defeat the tyrant, but the victory came at a staggering cost. As the mansion was consumed in a self-destruct sequence, Chris escaped into the night. But the man who had entered those woods was gone. He had witnessed the end of the world in miniature, and he had looked into the eyes of a monster who used to be his friend. Wesker seemingly died in the explosion, but the rivalry that was born that night would go on to define the next 10 years of Chris's life. He left the Arklay Mountains with a burning hatred for Umbrella and a terrifying knowledge of what the future held if they were not stopped. Part 4: Umbrella's Cover-Up and Raccoon City Fallout. When Chris Redfield, Jill Valentine, and Barry Burton finally emerged from the smouldering ruins of the Arklay Mountains, they believed their nightmare was over. They expected that the evidence they carried, the memories of the horrors they witnessed, the samples of the virus, and the testimony of elite law enforcement officers would be enough to bring the Umbrella Corporation to its knees. Chris, still reeling from the visceral trauma of seeing his teammates devoured by the T virus, assumed that the truth would be an unstoppable force. He was wrong. The return to Raccoon City was not a hero's homecoming. It was the beginning of a cold, bureaucratic assassination of his character and his sanity. The fallout of the Spencer Mansion incident was immediate and devastating. As soon as the survivors reached the Raccoon City Police Department, they encountered a wall of silence and hostility. The city was not a sanctuary. It was a corporate territory. Umbrella had spent decades weaving its influence into every facet of the local government, and that influence was now being weaponized to erase the truth. Chief Brian Irons, a man Chris had once respected as a superior officer, revealed himself to be a fundamental part of the conspiracy. Irons, who was receiving massive bribes and kickbacks from Umbrella, worked tirelessly to discredit the STARS unit. He portrayed the survivors as suffering from mass hysteria or post-traumatic stress disorder, brought on by a failed training exercise in the mountains. Chris found himself in a waking nightmare. He would walk through the halls of the police department and see the empty desks of his fallen friends, only to be told by his superiors that those deaths never happened the way he described. The official report filed by Chief Irons stated that the STARS teams had been lost due to a catastrophic equipment failure and a series of freak animal attacks. The mention of the T virus, the Tyrant, and the hidden laboratory was scrubbed from the record entirely. When Chris tried to go to the local press, he found that the editors were either on the Umbrella payroll or too terrified to print a word against the pharmaceutical giant. Every avenue for justice was being systematically closed. This era was a period of intense disillusionment for Chris. He watched as the legal system he had sworn to uphold was dismantled by corporate greed. He began to experience a profound sense of isolation. The citizens of Raccoon City continued their daily lives, oblivious to the fact that they were living on top of a biological time bomb, while the men who tried to save them were being branded as lunatics. This frustration began to manifest as a cold, calculating rage. Chris realized that he could no longer fight Umbrella from within the badge. The police department was a cage, and Chief Irons was the jailer. By August of 1998, Chris knew he had to make a choice. If he stayed in Raccoon City, he would eventually be disappeared or framed for a crime he didn't commit. He huddled with Jill and Barry in secret, realizing that the only way to stop Umbrella was to take the fight to their headquarters in Europe. This was the moment Chris Redfield truly went rogue. He surrendered his badge, but he did not surrender his mission. He made the heartbreaking decision to leave his younger sister, Claire, behind without telling her the full truth. He knew that if she were associated with his crusade, she would become a target. He wanted her to live a normal life, far away from the shadows he was about to inhabit. As he packed his bags for Europe, Chris looked at Raccoon City for what he thought would be the last time. Realizing that the law had failed and only the warrior remained, he was no longer a servant of the city. He was a hunter of the corporation. Part 5. Going Underground After Raccoon City. The transition from a decorated police officer to an international fugitive was a transformation that tested every ounce of Chris Redfield's military training. Once he arrived in Europe, he effectively ceased to exist in the eyes of the law. He had no official standing, no government backing, and no resources other than his own skills and a small network of trusted contacts. He was a ghost operating in the periphery of society, moving through the rain-slicked streets of Paris, Zurich, and London, hunting for any trace of Umbrella's upper management. This was the era of the deep undercover Chris, a man who lived in cheap motels, used false identities, and spent his nights monitoring encrypted corporate frequencies. However, while Chris was stalking the corridors of European power, the world he left behind was being consumed by fire. In September of 1998, the very nightmare he had tried to warn the world about finally exploded in Raccoon City. The T virus had leaked into the city's water supply, turning a population of over 100,000 people into a sea of the walking dead. From his vantage point in Europe, Chris could only watch in horrified silence as the news reports filtered in. He saw the grainy footage of the chaos, the screams of the dying, and eventually the terrifying flash of the thermobaric missile that wiped Raccoon City off the map. The destruction of Raccoon City was a psychic blow that nearly broke him. The survivor's guilt was overwhelming. He had spent years protecting that city, and he had spent months trying to warn them, yet in the end they were all erased. He felt the weight of every soul lost in that blast. believing that if he had stayed, or if he had fought harder to expose Irons, maybe things would have been different. This guilt was compounded by the fact that he had no idea where his sister, Claire, was. He had tried to keep her safe by staying away, but the irony was that the danger had come to her doorstep while he was thousands of miles across the ocean. This period of his life was defined by a shift from investigation to pure, unadulterated combat. Chris stopped trying to gather evidence for a court of law. He knew now that there would never be a trial for Umbrella. The corporation was too big to be sued. It had to be killed. He began using his Air Force training to conduct acts of industrial sabotage and tactical reconnaissance. He tracked Umbrella's private cargo ships and infiltrated their secondary research outposts. He became a one-man army, a priority target for Umbrella's private security forces, known as the Umbrella Biohazard Countermeasure Service. The underground era also saw Chris refining his tactics against bioorganic weapons. He realized that the monsters of the Spencer Mansion were just the beginning. In the various labs he scouted, he saw the blueprints for horrors even more advanced than the Tyrant. He began to adapt his gear and his training, focusing on high-caliber weaponry and heavy ordnance. He was no longer a man who carried a standard-issue pistol. He was a man who carried a combat shotgun and enough explosives to level a building. He was preparing for a war that most of the world didn't even realize was happening. He was a man fueled by the ashes of Raccoon City, a ghost who would not rest until the company that burned his home was nothing but a memory. This was the birth of the legendary Chris Redfield, the man who would eventually become the world's greatest shield against the dark, forged in the fires of loss and the cold reality of life in the shadows. Part 6. Chris versus Umbrella. Early anti-bioweapon operations. The period between late 1998 and early 1999 was a blur of violence and adrenaline for Chris Redfield. Having abandoned his official identity, he operated as a nomad across the European continent, a ghost haunting the edges of Umbrella's vast empire. This was the era of the early Black Ops, a time when Chris was forced to reinvent the rules of warfare. He was no longer fighting bank robbers or local gangs. He was fighting a multi-billion-dollar corporation that possessed its own private army and a biological arsenal that could rewrite the laws of nature. Chris spent his nights in cramped, windowless safe houses, surrounded by maps of industrial zones and encrypted frequency scanners. Every day was a tactical puzzle: how to infiltrate a high-security research facility with nothing more than a combat knife, a stolen sidearm, and a handful of plastic explosives. During these months, Chris began to realize that the threat was far more widespread than he had initially feared. In his raids on secondary, Umbrella outposts, he found evidence of a global distribution network that moved viral samples like common commodities. He encountered early prototypes of bioorganic weapons that were even more specialized than the ones he had faced in the Arklay Mountains. He saw creatures designed for aquatic infiltration, others built for high-speed urban pursuit, and some that were designed solely to act as biological landmines. To survive these encounters, Chris had to evolve. He refined his combat style, moving away from the rigid protocols of the police department and toward a more fluid, guerrilla style of warfare. He learned how to exploit the specific biological weaknesses of each creature, using fire, electricity, and high-caliber rounds with surgical precision. He became a student of the monsters he hunted, believing that to defeat the virus, he had to understand the mind of the architect who built it. However, the most significant development of this era was not the physical combat, but the formation of a shadow network. Chris knew that one man, no matter how skilled, could not topple an empire. He began reaching out to former STARS members who had survived the various outbreaks, as well as anti-umbrella activists and whistleblowers who had been silenced by the company's legal department. He was building an underground resistance, a group of dedicated individuals who shared his singular goal. They traded intelligence, shared equipment, and provided each other with the psychological support necessary to keep fighting a seemingly unwinnable war. Chris became the silent leader of this movement, a figure of myth among those who worked in the shadows. He was the man who had looked into the abyss and refused to blink. This era was also defined by a growing sense of cold, professional detachment. The idealistic Chris, who joined the police force, was being replaced by a soldier who saw the world in terms of tactical objectives and casualty rates. He witnessed the collateral damage of Umbrella's greed in small, forgotten villages, where the company tested its pathogens on unsuspecting populations. He saw the hollowed-out eyes of survivors and the mass graves that the corporate cleaners tried to hide. Each of these sites added another layer to his iron and sorrow. He was no longer fighting for a salary or a promotion. He was fighting because he was the only one who knew the truth and possessed the skill to do something about it. He was a man fueled by a quiet, burning fire. A vigilante who had realized that in a world of monsters, the only thing more dangerous than the virus was the man who had nothing left to lose but his mission. Part 7, Code Veronica, begins, searching for Claire. In December of 1998, the mission of Chris Redfield underwent a sudden and traumatic shift. While he was deep undercover in Europe, he received an urgent message from a young man named Leon Kennedy. Leon, a survivor of the Raccoon City disaster, informed Chris that his sister, Claire, had been captured while searching for him. She had been taken to a remote umbrella facility on Rockford Island. The news hit Chris like a physical blow. For months, his primary motivation for staying away was to keep Claire safe, believing that if she were not associated with his hunt, the corporation would ignore her. The realization that his absence had actually drawn her into the fire filled him with a crushing sense of guilt. He had failed the one person he cared about most, and the thought of her in the hands of Umbrella's torturers was more than he could bear. Without a second thought, Chris abandoned his current operations and turned all his resources toward Rockford Island. This was a different kind of mission. It wasn't about sabotage or intelligence gathering. It was a desperate race against time. The logistics of the rescue were a nightmare. Rockford Island was a heavily fortified military base and prison, guarded by Umbrella's most elite security forces and surrounded by shark-infested waters. Chris had to secure a private aircraft, navigate international airspace without detection, and prepare for a solo assault on a fortress that was designed to be impenetrable. The emotional weight of the mission was staggering. Throughout the flight, he replayed every memory of their childhood, every promise he had made to protect her after their parents died. Claire was his last link to a normal life, the only person who remembered him as a brother rather than a soldier. As he approached the island, Chris could see the smoke rising from the distance. The facility was already in the midst of a full-scale outbreak, the very thing he had spent the last year trying to prevent. This added a new layer of terror to the mission. He wasn't just fighting soldiers anymore. He was fighting the clock before the virus consumed his sister. When his boots finally hit the ground of Rockford Island, Chris was a man possessed. He moved with a speed and ferocity that shocked the island's defenders. He bypassed security locks with explosives and tore through waves of infected with a cold, mechanical efficiency. This mission proved that despite his hardened exterior and his focus on the global threat, Chris Redfield's heart was still tethered to his family. His sister was his moral compass, the reason he still believed the world was worth saving. The search for Claire on Rockfort Island was the ultimate test of his resolve. He had to balance his protective instincts with the tactical reality of a biohazard zone. Every scream he heard in the distance made his blood run cold, and every empty cell he found increased his desperation. He was no longer a vigilante or a ghost. He was a brother on a warpath, and heaven help anyone, human or monster, who stood between him and his family. This was the beginning of the Code Veronica incident, a mission that would force Chris to confront not just the monsters of Umbrella, but the ghosts of his own past. Part 8, Rockfort Island and the Ashford Legacy. The assault on Rockfort Island was supposed to be a simple rescue mission, but it quickly transformed into an encounter with a kind of evil that Chris had never imagined. While the Spencer Mansion was a product of corporate greed and cold science, Rockfort Island was the domain of the Ashford family, a twisted dynasty of aristocratic madness. As Chris navigated the island's Gothic architecture and macabre torture chambers, he realized he had stepped into the middle of a family legacy built on inbreeding, ego, and biological experimentation. The Ashfords did not see the virus as a weapon to be sold. They saw it as a means to reclaim their perceived ancestral glory and achieve a form of dark divinity. Chris was forced to witness the horrifying results of this ideology firsthand. He encountered the Ashford twins, Alfred and Alexia, whose relationship was a disturbing blend of codependency and delusion. Alfred, the commandant of the island, was a man whose mind had completely fractured under the weight of his family's expectations, frequently dressing as his sister and carrying out her cruel orders. But it was Alexia who represented the true threat. She was a genius who had spent 15 years in a self-induced cryogenic sleep to bond with the T. Veronica virus, a pathogen she had created by combining the progenitor virus with the DNA of ancient queens and insects. To Chris, Alexia was the ultimate perversion of nature, a woman who had intentionally discarded her humanity to become something cold, hive-minded, and monstrously powerful. The environment of Rockfort Island reflected this madness. Chris found himself fighting through a mock European village, a lavishly decorated mansion that mirrored the Spencer estate, and a subterranean prison that smelled of ancient decay. He faced the Nosferatu, a creature that was once the patriarch of the Ashford family, a man who had been used as a guinea pig by his own children. Seeing the physical and mental degradation of the Ashfords provided Chris with a terrifying new perspective on the biohazard threat. He realized that the danger wasn't just coming from boardrooms. It was coming from individuals who possessed the resources of a nation and the morality of a predator. This mission also forced Chris to realize that the scale of the conflict was expanding. The T. Veronica virus was fundamentally different from the T virus. It allowed for a level of intelligence and coordination among the infected that was far more dangerous than the mindless shambling of the Raccoon City zombies. It was a virus designed for conquest, not just destruction. As Chris fought his way through the island's defenses, he felt a growing sense of dread. The world he was trying to save was being targeted by people who viewed common humanity as a failed experiment. Rockfort Island was a graveyard of the old world, a place where the Ashfords tried to bury the truth and birth a new, horrific era. For Chris, destroying the Ashford legacy became just as important as finding Claire. He understood now that as long as even one of these architects remained alive, the human race would never be safe. He was no longer just fighting for his sister. He was fighting to ensure that the madness of the Ashfords did not become the template for the future of the planet. Part 9. Antarctica. Wesker returns, and the rivalry begins. The search for Claire on Rockfort Island eventually led Chris Redfield to the absolute edge of the world. Following the trail of the Ashford family, Chris traveled to a secret umbrella research facility hidden beneath the frozen wastes of Antarctica. It was here, amidst the ice and the sub-zero temperatures, that his mission underwent its most profound and terrifying shift. He had come to save his sister, but he found himself face to face with a ghost. In the heart of the Antarctic transport terminal, Chris encountered Albert Wesker. This was a moment that should have been impossible. Chris had watched Wesker die in the Spencer mansion, impaled by the claws of the tyrant. Yet standing before him was a man who seemed more alive and more powerful than ever before. This was not the Wesker that Chris remembered. The cold, calculating captain of stars had been replaced by something that had transcended humanity. Wesker revealed that he had injected himself with an experimental virus prior to his apparent death, a gamble that had granted him superhuman strength, speed, and regenerative abilities. When Wesker struck, Chris realized that his elite military training was no longer enough. He was moved by a force that felt like a runaway freight train. He watched as Wesker moved with a speed that defied the human eye, dodging bullets and striking with the precision of a predator. For the first time in his life, Chris felt the chilling sensation of true helplessness. He was a man of flesh and bone, fighting a god of the new biological age. The confrontation in Antarctica redefined the rivalry between the two men. It was no longer a matter of a soldier hunting a traitor. It was a cosmic struggle between two different visions for the future of the species. Wesker viewed humanity as a failed experiment, a weak and stagnant race that needed to be forcibly evolved or discarded. Chris, despite all the sorrow he had witnessed, remained the ultimate defender of the common human spirit. He saw Wesker not as a god, but as the ultimate perversion of everything the Air Force and the police force had taught him to protect. The Antarctic facility became the arena for this ideological war. As the base began to tear itself apart under the stress of the T. Veronica outbreak and the self-destruct sequences, the two men traded blows amidst the fire and the falling ice. Chris eventually managed to escape the facility with Claire, but the victory was hollow. He had saved his sister, but he had unleashed a shadow that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The realization that Wesker was the true architect behind the curtain changed the way Chris approached every subsequent mission. He understood now that Umbrella was just a shell, a vehicle for Wesker's much larger and more terrifying ambitions. The rivalry that began in the Arklay Mountains had now become a blood feud that spanned continents. Chris left the Antarctic ice with a new, singular purpose. He would not just destroy the company. He would hunt down the man who had stolen his peace and was now threatening to steal the future of the world. This era marked the birth of the Wesker obsession, a drive that would push Chris to the very limits of his sanity and physical endurance in the years to come. Part 10. Chris declared dead, and the world moves on. In the aftermath of the Antarctic incident, Chris Redfield made a choice that would define the next several years of his life. He realized that as long as he was a known quantity, a former police officer and a public figure of interest, he was limited by the laws and the surveillance of a world that was increasingly compromised by Umbrella's influence. To truly strike at the heart of the global biohazard network, he needed to disappear. With the help of his sister, Claire, and a few trusted allies, Chris orchestrated a plan to have himself declared dead. In the eyes of the official record, Chris Redfield became a casualty of his various conflicts, a tragic hero whose story had come to a violent end. This dead man status granted Chris a level of freedom that he had never before experienced. He became a ghost, a phantom operating in the deep shadows of the international intelligence community. He moved through the world under a dozen different aliases, never staying in one place for more than a few days. He was no longer bound by jurisdictional lines or the red tape of government agencies. He was a hunter who could go wherever the virus was being cultivated. During these years, he became a myth. Soldiers in remote war zones spoke of a lone operative who would appear in the middle of an outbreak, clear out the infected with mechanical efficiency, and vanish before the authorities arrived. They called him a guardian, a reaper, or a spirit, but only a handful of people knew the name behind the legend. However, the psychological cost of living as a dead man was immense. Chris was forced to cut himself off from the world he was trying to save. He could not contact his old friends, and he could only watch from a distance as the world moved on without him. He saw Jill Valentine continue her own struggle, and he felt the ache of his inability to stand by her side. He lived in a state of permanent isolation, his only companion being the iron and sorrow that had become his constant shadow. He spent his nights in dingy hotel rooms, cleaning his weapons and studying the movement of viral black markets, his life reduced to a series of tactical objectives. He was a man who had sacrificed his identity for a war that had no end in sight. While the world believed he was gone, Chris was actually conducting the most important work of his career. He was infiltrating the deepest layers of Umbrella's global supply chain, identifying the puppet masters and the funders who kept the biohazard alive even after the company's public face began to crumble. He was the invisible shield that prevented dozens of localized outbreaks from becoming global catastrophes. By the time the world finally realized that Chris Redfield was still alive, he had become the most experienced and lethal bioweapon specialist on the planet. He had spent his death becoming exactly what the world needed. A soldier who could look into the darkness and not be consumed by it, because he had already given up everything he had to lose. This era of the drunken ghost and the shadow operative laid the foundation for the eventual formation of the BSYNA, as Chris realized that even a ghost eventually needs an army to win a war. Part 11, Private Wars Against Umbrella and the Fall of the Corporation. By the year 2003, the shadow war that Chris Redfield had been waging for half a decade finally reached its definitive and bloody conclusion. For years, Chris and Jill Valentine had been operating as the primary spearhead of a private regional containment unit. This was an elite, semi-autonomous force, funded by various interests that shared a singular goal: the total eradication of the Umbrella Corporation. They were no longer the desperate survivors of Raccoon City. They were now the world's most lethal experts in anti-biological warfare. The culmination of their journey took them to the frozen, desolate landscape of Russia, specifically to the Caucasus Laboratory. This facility was Umbrella's last true bastion, a gargantuan underground fortress where the company had consolidated its final research projects and its most powerful assets. This mission was not just another tactical raid. It was the final stand against the corporate monster that had haunted Chris's every waking moment since 1998. The assault on the Caucasus Laboratory was a masterpiece of tactical execution and psychological resilience. Chris and Jill moved through the facility with a level of synergy that defied human explanation. A bond forged in the fires of the Spencer Mansion and tempered by years of shared combat. They faced a legion of the latest biological horrors, including enhanced versions of the Hunter series and specialized security units that were more machine than man. However, the true terror of the facility was the T-Alpha Liberator operational system, commonly known as Talos. This was the ultimate creation of the Umbrella Corporation, a massive bioorganic weapon encased in experimental ceramic armor and controlled by a sophisticated artificial intelligence. For Chris, defeating Talos was the physical manifestation of his struggle against the corporation's hubris. When the creature finally collapsed under the weight of their combined fire, it signaled the end of Umbrella's ability to threaten the planet on a corporate scale. The fallout of the Russian mission was the total legal and financial collapse of the Umbrella Corporation. The evidence gathered by Chris and Jill was finally enough to shatter the decades of corporate lobbying and political corruption that had protected the company. Within months, the corporation was dismantled, its assets were seized by world governments, and its leaders were hunted as international war criminals. For the public, this seemed like the end of the nightmare. The giant had fallen, and the world could finally breathe. But as Chris watched the corporate towers fall, he felt a deep and unsettling dread. He realized that while the company was dead, the poison it had created was now out in the wild. The technology to create monsters was no longer the exclusive property of a single boardroom. It had become a commodity, leaked, sold, and stolen during the corporation's death throes. The fall of Umbrella did not bring Chris Redfield the peace he had dreamed of. Instead, it brought a new kind of iron and sorrow. He understood that the war had simply evolved into a more chaotic and unpredictable form. The enemy was no longer a single logo or a specific skyscraper. The enemy was now everywhere. He saw that the destruction of Umbrella was not the end of the story, but merely the closing of a chapter. He stood among the ruins of the Russian lab, a victor who knew that the true era of biological horror was only just beginning. He had killed the architect, but the blueprints were already in the hands of the world. Part 12. The Birth of Global Bioterror. In the immediate wake of the Umbrella collapse, the world entered a terrifying and unstable era that Chris Redfield had predicted with grim accuracy. This was the birth of global bioterror. Without the centralized control of a single corporation, the black market for biological weapons exploded into a multi-billion-dollar industry. Ancient and volatile pathogens like the T virus and the G virus became the new nuclear weapons of the 21st century. They were traded in the dark corners of the internet and sold to the highest bidder, from rogue states to nihilistic terrorist cells. Chris watched with a growing sense of horror as localized outbreaks began to erupt in every corner of the globe. These were no longer the results of industrial accidents. They were intentional acts of war used to destabilize nations and erase entire populations. This era forced Chris to confront the harsh reality that private warfare was no longer sufficient. He realized that the small network of activists and former soldiers he had been leading was being overwhelmed by the rising tide of biological chaos. The threat was too vast, moving at a geometric rate that far outpaced any individual effort. He saw governments struggling to respond to outbreaks that could turn a bustling metropolis into a graveyard within 48 hours. He witnessed the rise of independent bioweapon developers who lacked even the shred of corporate self-preservation that Umbrella once possessed. The world was becoming a playground for a new breed of architects of extinction, and the existing international defense structures were completely obsolete in the face of this biological age. The psychological toll on Chris during this transition was immense. He felt like a man trying to stop a tidal wave with a single shield. every successful containment was overshadowed by two new infections appearing elsewhere. His survivor's guilt evolved into a heavy, permanent sense of responsibility for the entire human species. He began to see the faces of the people he could not save in every news report of a corrupted village or a quarantined city. He realized that to save humanity, he would have to help build something entirely new. An organization that transcended national borders and possessed the tactical, scientific, and political resources to fight the virus on its own terms. This period of his life was the catalyst for his most ambitious project yet. Chris spent his days in high-level meetings with international diplomats, often appearing as the only man in the room who truly understood the horror they were facing. He used his legendary status to bridge the gap between competing national interests, arguing that a biological threat did not recognize borders. He was no longer just a soldier. He was a founding advocate for a global response force. But even as he helped draft the charters for what would become the Alliance, the sorrow in his heart remained. He knew that by creating a global army to fight the virus, he was admitting that the monsters were now a permanent part of human existence. The birth of global bioterror meant that the world Chris had sworn to protect was gone forever, replaced by a reality where the air, the water, and the very bodies of human beings were potential instruments of mass destruction. Part 13. BSAA formation and Chris as a frontline soldier. By the mid-2000s, the landscape of global security had changed forever. The fall of the Umbrella Corporation had not brought the peace that Chris Redfield had spent years fighting for. Instead, it had opened a Pandora's box of biological instability. Recognizing that no single nation could handle the threat of decentralized bioterror, Chris became one of the 11 founding members of the Bioterrorism Security Assessment Alliance, or the BSAA. This organization was designed to be a non-governmental entity with the authority to operate across international borders, a necessity in a world where viruses did not respect national sovereignty. For the first time since his days in STARS, Chris had a legitimate badge and a massive infrastructure behind him. However, his role within the BSAA was unique. While the other founding members moved into high-level administrative and diplomatic roles, Chris Redfield made a choice that would define his legacy. He refused a desk job. Chris insisted on remaining a frontline operative within the Special Operations Unit. He understood that the real war against bioterror was not won in briefing rooms or through diplomatic cables, but in the dark, infected corners of the world, where the viruses were actually being deployed. He became the face of the BSAA's tactical wing, a legendary figure who led from the front. This era of his life was defined by a transition from a rogue vigilante back into a professional soldier, but with a level of experience that no other recruit could match. He became a mentor to a new generation of soldiers who had grown up in the shadow of Raccoon City. To them, Chris Redfield was more than a commander. He was a living symbol of resilience. He possessed a tactical intuition that felt almost supernatural, a sixth sense for biological threats that had been sharpened by a decade of constant combat. The formation of the BSAA also required Chris to navigate a complex political landscape. The alliance was funded by the Global Pharmaceutical Federation, an irony that was not lost on him. He was essentially working for an organization supported by the very industry that had birthed the Umbrella Nightmare. This created a permanent sense of tension in his life. He was always looking for the hidden agenda, always waiting for the next corporate betrayal. This skepticism became a core part of his leadership style. He taught his subordinates to trust their equipment and their teammates, but never to trust the higher powers that signed their paychecks. He was a man who had seen how easily a command structure could be corrupted, and he was determined to ensure that the BSAA remained a true shield for humanity, rather than a tool for corporate interests. During these early years of the Alliance, Chris traveled to every major outbreak zone on the planet. He saw the evolution of the threat firsthand, from the traditional zombies of the T-virus to more sophisticated and intelligent bioweapons. He was the one who developed the standard operating procedures for the BSAA, writing the manuals on how to contain a Level 4 biohazard. He was a man who lived out of a tactical harness, his life reduced to a series of flight paths and mission briefings. The iron and sorrow in his heart was now channeled into a professional discipline. He was the world's greatest frontline soldier, a man who had sacrificed any hope of a normal life to become a permanent barrier between the light of civilization and the darkness of biological extinction. He was the legend of the BSAA, the man who refused to stop fighting, even when the rest of the world wanted to look away. Part 14, Resident Evil 5. Setup, Kijuju, and Lost Jill. The year 2006 marked the beginning of the darkest chapter in the personal life of Chris Redfield. During a mission to the estate of Oswald Spencer, the founder of Umbrella, Chris and his partner, Jill Valentine, were ambushed by their longtime nemesis, Albert Wesker. The encounter was a catastrophe. Wesker, enhanced by his viral abilities, was on the verge of killing Chris when Jill made the ultimate sacrifice. She tackled Wesker through a massive window and off the side of a cliff, plunging into the dark waters of the ocean below. Despite an exhaustive search by the BSAA, neither of them were found. For 3 long years, Chris lived in a state of functional grief. The world believed Jill Valentine was dead, and a part of Chris had died with her. He buried his pain under a mountain of work, becoming a machine of pure efficiency, but his soul was hollowed out by the loss of the one person who truly understood him. By the year 2009, a lead on a black market deal involving a new biological threat took Chris to the Kijuju Autonomous Zone in Africa. He arrived in the heat of the African sun, not just as an agent of the BSAA, but as a man haunted by a ghost. He had received information that suggested Jill might still be alive, and that lead was the only thing keeping him from total psychological collapse. In Kijuju, he was paired with a local agent named Sheva Alomar. The situation in Africa was unlike anything Chris had faced before. The population had been infected with the Type 2 plagas, a parasite that allowed the hosts to maintain a level of intelligence and coordination that was far more dangerous than a standard viral outbreak. This was the debut of the Magini, and they represented the next step in the evolution of bioterror. The environment of Kijuju was a stark contrast to the cold laboratories of Chris's past. He was fighting in crowded marketplaces, sun-bleached shanty towns, and ancient underground ruins. The heat was oppressive, and the sheer number of infected was overwhelming. Throughout the mission, Chris's focus was split between the tactical reality of the outbreak and his desperate search for the truth about Jill. He was a man pushed to his absolute breaking point. He was forced to witness the total destruction of his fellow BSAA teams in Africa, a recurring trauma that reinforced his survivor's guilt. He felt as though he was a curse, the only man who always survived while everyone around him was slaughtered. This era was the ultimate test of Chris's resolve. He was no longer just fighting for a mission objective. He was fighting for the hope of redemption. Every step through the blood-soaked streets of Kijuju brought him closer to a confrontation with the ghosts of his past. He was a man fueled by a dangerous mixture of grief and hope. a combination that made him more lethal than ever, but also more vulnerable. He was walking into a trap set by the man he hated most, but he didn't care. If there was even a 1% chance that Jill was alive, he would burn the entire continent to find her. The setup for Resident Evil 5 was not just a mission about a parasite. It was the final, desperate struggle of a man who was tired of being the only one left standing. He was a shield that was beginning to crack, and the African sun was about to reveal the true depth of the darkness that had been growing in his heart since that night at the Spencer estate. Part 15, Wesker's Plan and Chris Redfield's Breaking Point. In the heart of the African continent, Chris Redfield reached the absolute limit of his psychological and physical endurance. As he pushed deeper into the underground facilities of the Tri-Cell Corporation, the true scale of Albert Wesker's ambition was revealed. This was no longer about local outbreaks or black market sales. Wesker's Ouroboros plan was a scheme for total global saturation. He intended to release a highly volatile and selective virus into the upper atmosphere, which would forcibly evolve or kill every human being on the planet. For Chris, this was the ultimate manifestation of the nightmare he had been trying to prevent since 1998. He was no longer fighting a corporation. He was fighting for the survival of the human species against a man who had discarded his own humanity to become a biological god. However, the mission took a devastatingly personal turn when Chris finally located the mysterious masked operative who had been stalking him. During a brutal confrontation, he unmasked the figure to reveal Jill Valentine. Seeing his best friend and partner alive, but brainwashed and controlled by a chemical device on her chest, was Chris's true breaking point. The iron in his heart was momentarily shattered by a wave of grief and fury. He was forced into a perverse game where he had to fight the woman he had spent 3 years mourning. This was the ultimate cruelty orchestrated by Wesker, designed to break Chris's spirit before the world was consumed. Every strike Chris was forced to deflect from Jill felt like a betrayal of their bond. He was a man trapped in a waking nightmare, forced to choose between the life of his closest friend and the fate of the entire world. The battle within the Tri-Cell facility was a testament to Chris's resilience. With the help of Sheva Alomar, he managed to restrain Jill and manually remove the control device, a procedure that required immense precision amidst total chaos. When Jill finally regained her consciousness, the emotional release for Chris was overwhelming, but there was no time for a reunion. The clock was ticking on the Ouroboros launch. Chris had to leave Jill behind to recover, while he pursued Wesker to his private jet. This era of the mission was defined by a desperate, frantic energy. Chris was a man who had been pushed past the point of exhaustion, fueled only by a cold, righteous anger. He was no longer a soldier following orders. He was a force of nature determined to end the cycle of violence that had defined his adult life. The African sun was setting, and the stage was set for the final act of a decade-long blood feud. Part 16, Jill's Return and the Death of Albert Wesker. The final confrontation between Chris Redfield and Albert Wesker took place in the throat of an active volcano, a setting that mirrored the volcanic intensity of their rivalry. After surviving a crash landing, Chris and Sheva Alomar stood their ground against a Wesker who had become desperate. In a final act of hubris, Wesker exposed himself to the Ouroboros virus, transforming into a massive, misshapen horror of black tendrils and metallic shards. This was the end of the god Wesker had imagined himself to be. He was reduced to a screaming, biological mess, driven by nothing but a primal urge to kill the man who had consistently thwarted his plans. For Chris, this was the moment of finality. He was no longer fighting the man he once respected as a captain. He was putting down a rabid animal that threatened the existence of all life. The battle was a grueling test of strength and teamwork. Chris famously used his bare hands to move a massive boulder to clear a path for Shiva, an act that has since become legendary as a symbol of his sheer, stubborn will. As the volcano threatened to consume them all, a rescue helicopter piloted by Josh Stone and carrying a recovered Jill Valentine arrived. In a coordinated strike, Chris and Shiva fired a dual rocket launcher blast into the heart of the Barry Wesker. The explosion was absolute. Albert Wesker, the architect of a decade of horror, was finally erased from existence. As the helicopter flew away from the erupting island, Chris looked out over the ocean with Jill by his side. The war he had started in the Arklay Mountains was over. However, the victory felt hollow. As the adrenaline faded, Chris began to realize the cost of his obsession. He had spent 10 years of his life hunting a single man, and while the world was safer, Chris was a different person. He looked at his hands and saw the blood of countless missions, and he began to wonder if he was even capable of existing in a world without a Wesker to fight. The death of his nemesis did not bring the peace he expected. Instead, it left a massive, silent void in his life. He was a hero to the world, but internally, he was a man who had lost his purpose. This was the beginning of his transition into a period of deep, somber reflection. He had ended the nightmare, but he was still trapped in the ruins of his own life. A soldier who had won the war, but lost his way home. Part 70 and after Wesker, post-traumatic stress and alcohol. In the years following the death of Albert Wesker, the iron and sorrow that had defined Chris Redfield began to take a heavy toll on his mental health. Without the singular focus of his rivalry to drive him, the decade of trauma he had suppressed began to surface. He was suffering from severe post-traumatic stress disorder, characterized by vivid flashbacks of the teammates he had lost and the horrors he had witnessed. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the faces of the fallen STARS members and the soldiers who had died under his command in Africa. He felt a crushing sense of responsibility for every life lost, a guilt that no amount of medals or commendations could soothe. He was a legendary commander in the BSAA, but he felt like a fraud who was simply the lucky one who always survived. By the year 2012, Chris's psychological state had deteriorated significantly. He began to seek solace in alcohol, trying to drown the memories of the screaming and the smell of burning flesh. He was still a functional soldier on the surface, but his edges were fraying. During a mission in the war-torn city of Edonia, Eastern Europe, this mental instability led to a catastrophe. Chris was leading a team of young recruits, including a talented operative named Piers Nevens. They were ambushed by a woman claiming to be Ada Wong, who was actually a double agent named Carla Radames. She trapped Chris's team and infected them with the new C virus, turning them into mutated horrors right before his eyes. Chris was forced to watch as the young men who looked up to him were transformed into monsters. The trauma of the Edonia incident was the final blow. During the retreat, Chris suffered a severe head injury that resulted in total amnesia. He wandered away from the battlefield and into the dark, rain-soaked streets of Eastern Europe. He had lost his memory, his team, and his sense of duty. For 6 months, the legendary Chris Redfield lived as a drunken ghost in the bars of a forgotten city. He was a man who had saved the planet multiple times but could not remember his own name. He spent his days drinking to forget a past he couldn't even describe, living in a state of primitive survival. This was the absolute lowest point of his life. A hero of the human race reduced to a nameless drunk in a dirty coat. A tragic example of how the war against bioterror could break even the strongest of souls. Part 18. Chris disappears. The pre-Resident Evil 6 mental collapse. The 6 months that Chris Redfield spent in a state of amnesia were a period of profound silence in the history of global security. The BSAA conducted a massive search for their missing commander, but Chris had effectively vanished into the underworld of Eastern Europe. He lived on the fringes of society, a man with haunted eyes and scarred knuckles who became a local legend in the bars he frequented. He was known for his incredible strength and his explosive temper, often getting into brutal bar fights that he barely remembered the next morning. This was not the rebellion of his youth in the Air Force. This was the total collapse of a man who had been asked to carry the weight of the world for too long and had finally buckled. Internally, Chris's mind was a battlefield of fragmented images. He had no context for the violence he felt in his soul, but he knew that he was a man built for war. He felt an instinctive repulsion whenever he saw images of biological research or pharmaceutical logos on the television, but he didn't know why. He was a man without a story, a hollowed-out vessel for a decade of combat reflexes. This era of his life represents the true danger of the life he led. It wasn't the monsters that finally defeated Chris Redfield. It was the accumulated weight of the sorrow. He had become a ghost of himself, a reminder that the cost of being a shield for humanity is often the destruction of one's own identity. He was eventually tracked down by Piers Nivens, who had never given up hope on his commander. When Piers finally confronted Chris in a dingy bar, he didn't find a hero. He found a broken man who didn't recognize him. Piers had to force Chris to look at photos of his fallen teammates, forcing the memories to flood back into his mind. The process of regaining his memory was excruciatingly painful, as Chris was forced to relive the deaths of his Edonia team all over again. He didn't want to be the legend. He wanted to stay in the dark where the guilt couldn't find him. But Piers reminded him of his duty and the fact that the world was currently facing a new C virus outbreak. Chris finally agreed to return to the BSAA, but he was not the same man. He was returning as a broken soldier, a man fueled by a dangerous, vengeful rage that would define his actions in the coming global conflict. Part 19. Resident Evil 6. The Broken Soldier Era. When Chris Redfield returned to active duty in the year 2013, he was a hollowed-out version of the hero the world knew. The amnesia had lifted, but it left behind a jagged landscape of trauma and a burning, toxic need for vengeance. This period is the darkest chapter of his command history, often referred to by military analysts as his broken soldier era. Chris was no longer motivated by the high-minded ideals of the Bioterrorism Security Assessment Alliance. Instead, he was driven by a primal, singular obsession with the woman he believed to be Ada Wong. He blamed her for the cold-blooded execution of his men in Edonia, and this personal vendetta completely compromised his tactical integrity. He returned to the field in Lanxiang, China, during a city-wide C virus outbreak, but he did not move like a protector. He moved like an executioner, leading his squads with a reckless, frantic energy that disregarded the lives of his own men in the pursuit of a shadow. The psychological landscape of Chris during the Lanxiang operation was one of total collapse, masked by military discipline. He was suffering from severe survivor's guilt, but he had twisted that guilt into a weapon. He believed that the only way to honor the men he lost was to kill the woman who took them, even if it meant sacrificing the team he currently led. This created a terrifying atmosphere for the soldiers under his command. They saw a legend who was willing to run headlong into a meat grinder, a man who had stopped caring about extraction points or civilian casualties. Chris was no longer the shield of the world. He was a blunt force instrument of revenge. His eyes were constantly scanning for a red dress, ignoring the tactical map and the deteriorating situation around him. He was a man who had lost his moral compass in the bottom of a bottle in Eastern Europe and had replaced it with a blood feud. Furthermore, this era showcased the dangerous friction between Chris and the next generation of soldiers. He was no longer a mentor. He was a cautionary tale. He ignored the pleas of his second in command, Piers Nivens, who watched as Chris's tunnel vision led them into one ambush after another. The iron in Chris had become brittle and sharp, cutting everyone who tried to help him. He was essentially trying to commit suicide by combat, looking for a glorious death to silence the screaming in his head. This period represents the absolute nadir of his professional career, a time when the sorrow had finally curdled into a hate so pure that it threatened to turn him into the very monsters he had spent decades hunting. He was a broken man in a uniform, walking through a burning city toward a confrontation that would either redeem him or destroy him forever. Part 20. Piers Nivens and the lowest moment for Chris. The mission in the underwater facility beneath the coast of Lanxiang became the ultimate site of Chris Redfield's psychological reckoning. As the facility began to collapse and the massive bioorganic weapon known as Chaos emerged, Chris found himself physically and mentally defeated. For the first time in his legendary career, he was truly helpless, pinned down by a creature that represented the peak of C-virus engineering. It was in this moment of total failure that the most tragic sacrifice of his life occurred. His partner and protege, Piers Nivens, realized that they could not win the battle through conventional means. Piers made the agonizing decision to inject himself with a concentrated dose of the C-virus to gain the strength needed to save Chris. This was the moment the legend of Chris Redfield was paid for, in the most expensive currency possible, the soul of a young, promising soldier. Watching Piers mutate was a psychological trauma that surpassed even the Spencer mansion. Chris was forced to witness the physical and mental degradation of his friend in real time, knowing that his own reckless behavior had led them to this point. Piers used his newly found, horrific powers to clear a path and launch Chris into an escape pod, refusing to leave the facility himself. As the pod ascended and the underwater base exploded, Chris was left in a state of absolute, crushing silence. He had been saved by the very thing he hated most. The loss of Piers was not just the loss of a soldier, it was the loss of Chris's successor. Piers was meant to be the future of the BSAA, the man who would carry the torch when Chris finally stepped down. Instead, Piers was a casualty of Chris's obsession. This was the lowest point of his entire existence, a moment where the sorrow became an ocean that threatened to drown him. The aftermath of this sacrifice forced a radical transformation in Chris's character. He emerged from that escape pod a changed man. The vengeful rage was gone, replaced by a somber, heavy sense of duty that was more profound than ever before. He realized that the only way to truly honor Piers was to live the life that Piers had died to protect. He had to be the leader that Piers believed in, not the broken man he had become. This event effectively ended the broken soldier era and birthed the grizzled veteran. He stepped back into the role of commander with a new level of caution and a renewed focus on the lives of his subordinates. He became a man who valued the safety of his team above all else, haunted by the memory of a young man who gave up everything to give his commander one last chance at redemption. Part 21. After Resident Evil 6, War Fatigue and Disillusionment. In the years following the global C-virus crisis, Chris Redfield entered a period of deep, systemic disillusionment. He had been fighting the biohazard war for over 20 years, and the promised victory seemed further away than ever. The BSAA had grown from a small, elite response force into a massive, bureaucratic global entity. But Chris began to notice that as the organization grew larger, its moral clarity grew dimmer. He began to suffer from a profound and chronic war fatigue. This was not the exhaustion of a single mission, but the weariness of a man who had seen the world almost end a dozen times, only to see the same mistakes repeated by new leaders. He felt like a relic of a simpler time, when the lines between the heroes and the villains were clearly defined by an umbrella logo. This era was marked by Chris's increasing isolation within the very organization he helped found. He began to see the BSAA High Command making decisions based on diplomatic optics and political pressure rather than tactical necessity. He witnessed the normalization of bioterror in the global news cycle, where outbreaks were treated as manageable risks rather than existential threats. This normalization disgusted him. He spent his nights in the BSAA headquarters, poring over reports and realizing that the black market for viral samples was more robust than ever. The iron and sorrow in his heart was now directed at the institutions he served. He felt that the world was becoming a playground for corporate interests that used the BSAA as a janitorial service to clean up their messes. To cope with this disillusionment, Chris began to pull away from the official chain of command. He formed the Hound Wolf Squad, an elite, hand-picked team of operatives who were loyal to him rather than the BSAA bureaucracy. This was the beginning of his transition into a rogue commander. He was still fulfilling his duties on the surface, but he was running his own shadow operations on the side. He was no longer interested in the politics of the Alliance. He was interested in the truth. This was a lonely time for Chris. He had lost his closest friends to death or retirement, and he found himself surrounded by young recruits who viewed him as a myth rather than a man. He was the old guard, a soldier who remembered the smell of the Arklay Mountains and could see the rot in the system that everyone else ignored. He was a man preparing for a betrayal he knew was coming. Part 22. Blue Umbrella and Moral Compromise. The year 2017 forced Chris Redfield to make a deal with the devil. He was tasked with leading a joint operation with Blue Umbrella, a private military company composed of former Umbrella employees who claimed they were dedicated to fixing the damage their predecessors had caused. For Chris, stepping onto a helicopter with the Umbrella logo was a moment of profound psychological crisis. It felt like a betrayal of every teammate he had ever lost. He was a man who had dedicated his life to erasing that name from the earth, and now he was being told to lead them into battle. This was the ultimate moral compromise, a sign that the war against bioterror had moved into a grey area where pure heroes no longer existed. During the Dulvey incident in Louisiana, Chris operated with a level of cold, professional suspicion that bordered on paranoia. He utilized Blue Umbrella's superior technology and specialized weaponry, but he never lowered his guard. He was constantly monitoring his allies for any sign of a double cross, ready to execute them the moment they showed their true colors. This mission was a grueling reminder of how far the world had drifted from the ideals of stars. He was hunting the E-Series bioweapon known as Everline, but he was doing it alongside the ghosts of the company that created the virus in the first place. Every tactical success in the Louisiana swamp felt tainted to him. He was doing his job, but he was losing his soul in the process. This period was also defined by Chris's realization that the threat was evolving beyond standard viral pathogens. The mold and the fungal mutations he encountered in Dulve represented a new, more insidious kind of biological horror, one that could manipulate memory and psychological perception. This reinforced his belief that the old ways of fighting were no longer sufficient. He became even more detached, even more focused on the cold data of the mission. He rescued Ethan Winters not out of a sense of heroism, but because Ethan was a key variable in understanding the new threat. Chris had become a man who viewed human beings as assets or liabilities in a global game of survival. The moral compromise of Blue Umbrella was the final layer of armor Chris needed to become the man who would later do the unthinkable in the Romanian village. He was a soldier who had accepted that to save the world, he had to be willing to get his hands dirty with the blood of his enemies and the ink of compromised contracts. Part 23, Resident Evil 7, The Secret Agenda of Chris. While the public reports of the Dulve incident focused on the rescue of the Winters family, the true mission of Chris Redfield was far more clandestine. Chris was not there just to contain an outbreak. He was there to secure the research data of a group known as the Connections. This was a criminal organization that had been operating in the shadows for years, moving biological weapons through a decentralized network. Chris had realized that the official BSAA investigation was being intentionally slowed down by internal corruption, so he used the joint operation with Blue Umbrella as a cover to conduct his own intelligence gathering. He was a man playing a double game, using the resources of his enemies to hunt a shadow that his superiors refused to acknowledge. This era revealed a new, more calculating side of Chris Redfield's personality. He was no longer the man who shared a beer with his squad. He was a master of information control. He kept the Winters family in a state of high security, moving them to Europe not to provide them with a peaceful life, but to keep them under his direct supervision. He knew that Mia Winters was a former operative for the Connections, and that her knowledge was the key to exposing the rot within the global security network. He was willing to be the antagonist in Ethan's life if it meant protecting the world from a much larger threat. He became a man of short, sharp sentences and secretive movements, a guardian who had decided that the truth was more important than the feelings of the civilians he protected. This secret agenda was the culmination of his years of disillusionment. He had stopped asking for permission and started asking for forgiveness. Or more accurately, he stopped caring about forgiveness altogether. He was operating on a timeline that only he and the Hound Wolf Squad understood. He spent his nights in secure bunkers, analyzing the data he had stolen from the Connections, realizing that the conspiracy reached into the highest levels of the BSAA High Command. He was a man preparing for a coup, a soldier who was ready to declare war on the very organization he had spent his life building. He was no longer just a fighter. He was a strategist who understood that the next war wouldn't be fought with rockets in a volcano, but with evidence and tactical strikes against corrupted leaders. He was the silent hunter, waiting for the perfect moment to strike at the heart of the new bioterror. Part 24, BSAA, Corruption and the End of Trust. The year 2021 saw the final death of Chris Redfield's faith in the structures of the modern world. During the events in a remote village in Romania, Chris uncovered the ultimate betrayal. The BSAA was now utilizing biological weapons as frontline soldiers. Seeing a mutated creature wearing the tactical gear and the patches of his own organization was a moment of profound, chilling clarity. It was the realization that the war was lost from within. The Alliance had become the new umbrella, using the excuse of global security to justify the very horrors they were founded to prevent. For Chris, this was the end of the line. The trust that had been fraying for a decade finally snapped, and he chose to go entirely rogue. This decision led to the most controversial actions of his life. He led the Hound Wolf Squad into the village to neutralize Mother Miranda and the Megamai seat, but he did so while appearing as a villain to Ethan Winters. He shot Mia Winters, who was actually a shape-shifting Miranda in disguise, and kidnapped Ethan's daughter, all without providing a single word of explanation. He had become so detached from the need for public approval that he didn't care if the world viewed him as a murderer. He was focused on the tactical objective, stopping the Megamai seat before it could spread. He was a man who had decided that his reputation was a small price to pay for the survival of the human race. He moved through the ruins of the village like a shadow, a commander who had finally accepted that he could only trust the people he had hand-picked himself. The conclusion of the village incident was not a moment of celebration for Chris. After the explosion that destroyed the Megamai seat and took the life of Ethan Winters, Chris was left with a heavy, bitter victory. He rescued the real Mia and the infant Rose, but he did so knowing that he was now a fugitive from his own organization. He boarded a helicopter and set a course for the BSAA European headquarters. He was not going there to surrender. He was going there to bring the truth to light through force. This was the birth of the Vigilante Commander era. He was no longer a soldier of the Alliance. He was a judge who was coming to collect. The iron and sorrow had reached its peak. He was a man with nothing left to lose, a legend who had been betrayed by the world he saved, and he was coming to ensure that those who corrupted his mission would pay the ultimate price. Part 25. Final verdict. Who Chris Redfield truly is. As we look at the history of Chris Redfield from the 1990s to the year 2026, we see the arc of a man who has been hammered into a weapon by the relentless cruelty of the world. He is the ultimate survivor of the biological age, a man who has outlived his enemies, his mentors, and his own youth. He is defined by a paradoxical combination of extreme lethality and a deep, quiet humanity that he can no longer afford to show. He is the man of iron and sorrow, the soldier who carries the memories of the dead like a heavy, invisible pack. He does not fight for glory, for rank, or for a flag. He fights because he is the only one left who remembers how it all started and understands where it will all end if someone doesn't stand in the gap. In 2026, Chris Redfield is a phantom in the world of global intelligence. He is the leader of a rogue cell of elite operatives who hunt the remnants of bioterror across the planet. He is a man who exists outside the law, a guardian who has realized that the law is too easily corrupted by the powerful. He is a mentor to Rose Winters, the daughter of the man he couldn't save, representing his final attempt at a personal legacy. He is a man who knows he is nearing the end of his physical capabilities, yet he refuses to stop. He is the final verdict on the human spirit, a testament to the fact that even after decades of trauma and betrayal, a person can still choose to do the right thing, even if they have to do it alone. He remains the shield that never breaks, but he is a shield covered in the scars of 1,000 battles. He is the man who looked into the abyss of the Spencer mansion and never looked away. He is the soldier who punched a boulder in a volcano, and the commander who stood against his own alliance. Chris Redfield is more than just a character in a history book. He is a symbol of the struggle for human survival in an age of biological madness. As long as there is a virus in a lab or a monster in a village, Chris Redfield will be there, waiting in the shadows with a rifle in his hand and the weight of the world on his shoulders. He is the sorrow of the past and the iron of the future. The man who ensures that even when the lights of civilization flicker, they never truly go out. Link to the official 2026 BSAA fugitive files for more information.